The Governor of the State of Washington, the Honorable Daniel J. Evans.
I suspect that the single item which would have the overwhelming majority would be gratitude that the year 1973 is finally over. By most calculations, I suppose it has been a dismal experience. Shortages occurring where none were expected. Evidence of felonious activities at the highest levels of government. A continuing rampant inflation, an accelerating erosion of public confidence in our institutions. But all seem to have combined in 1973 to lead us to welcome the new year with more than the usual fervor, and perhaps even more than the usual hope. But even as 1973 passes on with a tarnished reputation, some good, I think, can be seen from it. A brutal, a bloody war is over, almost forgotten in the other events of 1973. Not just over in the formal sense that American troops are no longer fighting in Southeast Asia, but over in the more profound sense that the Cold War outlook of 25 years seems finally to have ended, and new premises are now motivating this nation's foreign policy. In domestic affairs, even in the corrosive atmosphere of power and politics and prerogative that characterizes Washington, D.C., there seems to be some glimmerings of concern for the public interest. In this state, after the wild economic gyrations of the 1960s and early 1970s, we have come to an era of relative economic stability and growth. 1973 was the second best year in this state's economic history, and the prospects are still good for 1974. Beyond that, the people of Washington have demonstrated once again their ability to respond in a voluntary manner to the solution of difficult problems, most recently by the magnificent response during our recent and short electrical energy crisis. This same willingness on the part of most people personally to do what is necessary seems to have extended to other aspects of our energy shortage. But perhaps most important of all, outside observers continue to be amazed at the huge outpourings of people, citizens of this state, who are taking an active and a decisive role in the governmental as well as non-governmental processes in our society. In my judgment, we do stand unique among all of the states of this nation in the willingness, not to say the eagerness, of people to become involved. 1973 was a year of transition, a sort of a hinge of history in which we move from the old and familiar assumptions of what we call the post-World War II era into new times, the outlines of which are only vaguely yet on the horizon. But one fact has become quite apparent. The age of automatic abundance, even in this nation, is over. That most resources are and will be short for some time to come is now pretty well accepted as a fact of life. That we must move from an attitude of waste to an attitude of conservation is imperative. This must be a conservation not just of natural resources, but of human resources as well. The key factor, which now has the greatest significance for both this state and this nation, is that once again, we are going to be called upon to make choices. Since World War II, the standard popular response to most problems has not been the difficult process of setting priorities and distinguishing between options. Rather, enjoying the luxury of an economy and a gross national product which seemed to spiral upward forever, we solved most problems by the simple expedient of demanding more and getting it. Conspicuous consumption was not just the province of the wealthy, it became a national standard. And while there was always the political contest as to how large a share of the pie any particular interest would obtain, there was little doubt that the pie somehow would be made larger so that everyone could get at least something. Thus, new challenges and new concerns were met not by re-examining old responses, but merely by piling on new responsibilities. Now, of course, this in no way denies that enormous progress was made, or that the struggles of the 1960s, particularly in the field of civil rights, were essential. But 1973 was the year in which we finally realized that we had to start providing for a livable tomorrow by making some real choices today, all in the context of finite rather than infinite resources. At the same time, I think we're discovering, or perhaps rediscovering, a legacy, perhaps the greatest legacy, of those three presidents of the 20th century, most able by their words and deeds to inspire people to reach beyond themselves: Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. All were able to do this, and we are discovering that while we cannot escape history, we can, within reasonable limitations, be active makers of history rather than its helpless victims. Obviously, there are a number of imponderables over which we have no control. Furthermore, we are just at the threshold of our understanding and of our application of the process of policy planning and implementation. Necessary policy-making techniques are still in their formative stages. Nevertheless, with more sophisticated methods of data gathering, with a far greater ability to predict trends, with the availability of comprehensive population statistics, we can lay out the options for our future and can, if we will, to a large extent, determine what that future will be. Now let me take some examples here in our own state. Current long-range projections indicate that the population of this state will increase from its present 3.5 million to about 4.5 million, perhaps a little more, by the year 2000. This increase amounts to a little over 1 million additional people, or the equivalent of the Seattle-King County urban area. However, not all the growth is going to occur in Seattle and King County, but it will be geographically distributed in selected areas throughout the state. We still, then, are a state with room for people and resources to employ them. However, one of our major potential problems is the fact that over 85% of today's population in this state is confined to relatively small geographic corridors in both eastern and western Washington. This proportion of the total has been forecast to jump to over 90% by the year 2000. And given no additional changes, no changes in trends, these geographically confined areas of 30 to 50 miles wide from Bellingham on the north to Vancouver on the south, and in eastern Washington, the Yakima Valley and the Spokane area, will contain virtually all the people of our state. And while present population densities in these areas are now really comparatively comfortable, predicted densities could result in considerable pressure to our quality of life. And within the next 30 to 50 years, if state development itself is not planned and implemented in a most thoughtful manner, the future growth of the state of Washington can and must be planned and coordinated if the state is to avoid the problems experienced by California, the eastern states, the many urban centers of the Midwest, in fact, all urbanized areas of this nation over the past century. We do have the raw data and can reasonably predict the course of events if we do nothing. What we also have is the ability to question the necessity and the desirability of these events and to provide for alternative population growth and distribution and better employment opportunities if we choose to do so. And while population itself grows, we have what may be an even more difficult problem. That is, by the turn of this century, our population makeup itself will change and change radically. There will be fewer youngsters, far fewer youngsters than we have today as a percentage of our population. In fact, probably fewer in raw numbers in spite of a growing population. The ages from 40 to 60 will remain almost static in numbers in spite of that growth in population. But the young workforce, those from 20 to 40, will grow in huge numbers, as will those who are retired, or at least those who are 60 and above. Population distribution is but one facet, then, of an agenda for determining the future. Other areas, and by far not exclusive, in which we have the opportunity to decide include education, resource management, transportation, and the organization and the carrying out of governmental responsibilities themselves. Each one of these issues is one peculiarly suited to planning and resolution at the state and local level. If one major lesson has come from the political malaise of 1973, it is that there is no better place for people to address their problems than at the state and local levels. But while we ponder this realization, we need to understand that a citizenry disinclined to face state and local problems in that arena will almost certainly find them shifted into the political arena at the national level of government. So then, in education, as we face declining enrollments, as we surely will, and uncertain financing, as we surely do today, we need to determine what education really is, what we want it to be, and to rethink the contents and the purposes of organized education. This task is not, nor should it be, the exclusive preserve of the professional educator. It must also be the responsibility of every citizen. We need to develop better plans for resource management so as to maintain a quality environment, provide for rational land use, and an adequate economic base for the well-being of all of our citizens, and those should not and must not be conflicting goals. We in Washington are particularly fortunate in this regard. We start far ahead of most states, and we have a people who are unusually sensitive to the relationship between a proper management of resources on the one hand and a high quality of life on the other. The fuel shortage has and will continue to make us acutely aware of the need for rethinking our approach to transportation. While we must recognize that some form of mass public transit is necessary, so at the same time we must pay heed to the concept of transportation on demand. And we must meet that concept of transportation on demand if we are going to temper at all the American love affair with the private automobile. During the next several decades, the number of retired persons will double. We must structure our resources to respond to their needs by implementing ways in which older persons can be provided with satisfying leisure and recreational outlets, part-time occupations, learning opportunities, and adequate housing and medical facilities. Health care. Health care for all, regardless of income, is probably the most immediate major issue we face. Just as each young person in this state is guaranteed an opportunity for education, so should they be entitled to adequate health care at a reasonable cost. And during this next decade, employment itself may be our most vexing problem. In this 10-year period, the labor force in the state will grow by about 270,000 people. That's a net increase after retirements and withdrawals from the labor force. And this means 27,000 brand new jobs every year for the next 10 years, even if unemployment rates are not to be reduced. Not only do we need an expanding and diversified economy, but we may need to redefine what is considered to be gainful employment. The shift in the last 45 years from farm and manufacturing employment to service employment is continuing and accelerating. Many services accepted today as commonplace were regarded not too many years ago as of no value. Future opportunities very likely will include needed work not now having an economic value, but which in the future will be considered as worthy of compensation. And finally, I believe we should not shy away from the consideration of the structure of government itself. We must consider how to achieve the necessary balance between the requirements of a strong administrative structure to cope with the problems of a technological age and the appropriate checks and balances which need to be arrayed against this concentration of power. Beyond that, we need to re-examine the way in which representative government itself works, how we can make it work better, and the methods which can be devised for greater and more significant public participation in the decision-making process. And it's to that public participation in planning our future that I now turn. We're now at a point where policy planning is both necessary and desirable. We have within our grasp the ability to predict within limits what the future will be and also to determine what we want it to be. Through a policy planning process, a process which will be continuing and long-range in nature, we will be able to lay out the alternative futures available to this state and to each of us as citizens. And through public participation, arrive at those decisions as to what the future options ought to be. Much has been done during this past year to lay the groundwork for this effort. State government reorganization and research and planning has prepared us to take the next and most important step, that of public participation and decision-making. During the first 4 or 5 months of 1974, the Brookings Institution of Washington, D.C., under contract to the state of Washington, will operate its growth policy and development process with assistance from our Office of Program Planning and Fiscal Management, the 2 universities of our state, the Office of Community Development, and a number of other agencies. Approximately 150 citizens, including private and public sector representatives, will be involved in an initial intensive effort at determining basic growth policy options for the state of Washington. At the same time, the Brookings staff will utilize a questionnaire involving several thousand of our citizens to provide additional information to these seminar participants. And following the conclusion of this series, the policy options, and that's all they are policy options, will be identified and taken to a series of regional workshops in at least 4 to 6 areas of the state. These sessions, which will be open to the press and I hope covered fully, will consist of 100 to 150 participants from each region who will be asked to review these options and to express their own regional preferences and regional perspectives. Those persons from the region who sat in on the overall state group will participate in these meetings to assist in explanation and briefing sessions. And then in the summer and in the fall of 1974, it is my hope that we will have a period of intensive communication effort using media, publications, questionnaires, community meetings, and other methods. The growth policy options will be presented statewide for consideration of our citizens. The Washington State University Media Center will be used to produce television programs and spots for public and commercial station presentations. And toward the end of this period, it is expected that we can use a series of scientific polls and surveys to determine statewide reaction and preference to growth policy options. I would expect and hope by the fall of 1974 that the question of future options for this state would become part of the political process, and that it would be the source of considerable discussion in political campaigns and might, in the process, even raise the level of those political campaigns from the past. Consideration is also even being given to the potential use of an advisory ballot in the fall, in November of 1974, so that citizens might express themselves massively at an early point as to some of these future choices or options they desire. As information from the citizen and communications process becomes available, key participants will be reassembled to consider basic program options available then to state government. At that time, based on desirable future direction, an executive program will be assembled consisting of proposed legislation, program and resource priority decisions for the budget of 1975-77, and appropriate executive orders. By December of 1974, the first portion, but only the first, of a program to implement this state's long-term growth and policy development will be ready for presentation to the 1975 legislature and to the people. Beyond this formal program, I would hope that every governmental structure, every private organization, every institution in this state would examine its own future and join in this process of building a better Washington. Now, all of this I have described may sound lengthy, it may sound involved, and perhaps it is. But it has one goal in mind, or perhaps two. The first, of course, to select or to lay out for people the alternative choices which lay before us. And secondly, and perhaps needed as much as anything today with people's disenchantment with government and with all institutions, is the opportunity for people themselves to be massively involved in that decision-making process. And thus, we'll have no argument that no one listens and no one responds to what the people themselves believe. This can be, and I hope will be, one of the most exciting and productive enterprises upon which this state has ever embarked. It is my purpose in proposing this program to involve as many citizens as possible in its evolution. With one of the highest educational levels of any state in the nation, with a demonstrated public interest in quality living, and with a process for massive public participation, I believe the citizens of this state can, in an orderly and rational manner, determine their future and assure that such a privilege will also be available for generations yet to come. We have a great opportunity to re-examine, to reinvigorate, and to reform the great institutions of this state: social, political, economic, and educational, to meet our needs and to respond to our wishes. The burdens of citizenship aren't easy. They are great. They demand time and talent and energy of each one of us. But the rewards, if we respond, are even greater. Not in money or material possessions, but in the gifts which come with the knowledge that each person has done a full share in protecting and advancing the precious gift of self-government. This can be a year when the citizens of Washington decided that the promise of the future was more important than the concerns of the present, and when affirming our opportunities became more important than bemoaning our failures. A great president and a great man, one who was deeply immersed in the problems of his day, but whose vision extended beyond the needs of his immediate generation, put it exceptionally well. Theodore Roosevelt said, "It is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled, nor where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best, in the end, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. We do have a worthy cause. 1974 is the year to be about the task. Thank you.